Welcome to the Experts in Sport podcast, brought to you by the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences at Loughborough University.
Today I'm with Dr. Ian Taylor and we're here to talk about his new book, Time Hacks. Hi Ian, thanks for coming on the Experts in Sport podcast.
Hi Martin, thanks for having me.
No problem. This is the second time you've been on, and you probably remember, and our audience may remember this. You were episode 35, How to Stay Motivated on Your New Year Fitness Journey. And that was back in January 2023. So quite a while ago. But today we're going to be focusing on your new book, Time Hacks. For those who want to get to know you a little bit more about you and why they should read the book, can you just give us a bit of a background to yourself?
I hold the title Reader in Motivation Science at Loughborough University, and I work in the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences. And I study motivation primarily, but motivation in quite a broad sense. Essentially, what my research concerned is being motivated to achieve and progress and develop, or without sacrificing your well-being. So obtaining that balance, and essentially, as we'll hopefully discuss, that's what the book is about. And when I was starting to write the book, the time element came through, in that all the processes that I wanted to write about all had time sort of integrated within them, and so the book Time Hacks: The Psychology of Time and How to Spend It was born.
Excellent, and I said this to you off the video. It's brilliant. I love the book. Anybody who knows me will know I'm not just going to say these things because we're on a podcast. I genuinely loved it, and I have spent time reading numerous of the classic personal development books, and over the years, and that's going on for 20 years really, but over the years, all the new ones say the same stuff. If you've read early kind of, I don't know, Think and Grow Rich as a famous example, Napoleon Hill. If you've read that, then all the new ones just basically follow the same pattern. This doesn't, and that's why I really, really liked it. I thought there's a great mix of philosophy, research, facts, fun. There's some amusing parts in it as well, which really, really add to it. But then also real practical advice that you can kind of deliver and implement for yourself. So genuinely loved it. We're going to talk about it now. So what I wanted to try and do is kind of just get straight into it around what the book's about and why people should read it, which you've touched upon a little bit, but then probably dig into a few of the chapters. So if you could just give us a bit of background on what the book is and why you should read it, and then let's jump straight into time warps, the first kind of chapter.
Okay, well, the book. Thanks for the compliments about the book. It's interesting about reading about all the sort of personal development books and things, because I've read a few, not many, and when I was writing this book, I got scared to read any other books, because I didn't want to copy their ideas. I didn't want to read something and think, oh, that's a good idea, I'll sort of do that as well. And I hope that sort of helped me out in presenting a few new things in the book. And I just wanted to write a book that I wanted to read. I didn't want it to be, like I say, there's funny bits, and I didn't want it to be too sciencey. I wanted to be accessible for most people, but just anyone who's engaged in that type of book. But I didn't want it to be just nonsense. Just anecdotes and nonsense. So I wanted to be in that nice middle ground where the stuff that I was saying I could quite happily support with a bit of science, but I didn't want it to dominate the text. And so hopefully that comes about. And I like films. I like stories. I like anecdotes and things like that. So I wanted to incorporate those things to bring the scientific ideas to life, rather than just present these scientific ideas. And then it's interesting you say there's lots of practical strategies in the book. That I must give a shout out to my publishing editor. The original publishing editor in the first book was called Holly Harley, and she said, the first draft, she said, you need more practical strategies, because some of it is messy. I didn't want to go down this is what you should do to be more productive or happier, because life's not like that. Life's messy. I wanted it to be, these are the ideas. Take what you will from it and have a toolkit. Whereas, Holly was very much, but you need some practical strategies. So, so hopefully people use the book, if they read the book and enjoy it, and then hopefully they just use it as a toolkit. Nobody's going to implement. There's 117 strategies in there in the final chapter. No one's going to I hope nobody's going to implement all 117 strategies, but you take a few and you use what works for you, and see if that provides any benefit.
That's exactly how it comes across. It comes across massively that, the I think it's got 101 time hacks, potentially it's called at the end, which is actually 117, you may have just said. That I got to that bit and I was like, oh, great, because this just kind of summarizes all those practical pieces that I've just read about. And so when I'm reading these as you can take this and do this, it's like, well, I understand why, because you've talked to me about that already in the chapter. So having that at the end and really helped. And I thought, well, I'm going to have a look and I'm going to highlight top five that we're going to do. I'm going to ask you this later. I end up highlighting 21. So there's quite a few in there. And I was like, oh, that one's good. Some of them I didn't highlight because I'm like, well, I already do that. So this is where it's kind of like, it's not, you've got to do this, this, and this. It's like, look, here's a load of ideas linked to you as an individual. I've given you some evidence earlier about why these are quite important, and everyone's going to be in a different place. So it might be that, I don't know, chapter 5 is really relevant for somebody, but chapter 6 is really relevant for someone else. So I just think it works on so many different levels for so many different people that I genuinely think it's a great book. So thank you for writing it. Let's give people a flavour of what it's about. So can you speak to us about that first chapter around time warps, and a couple of the bits that jumped out to me, and I may have jumped into a couple of chapters here. So some of the things that jumped out were around, one funny thing was around alarm clocks and knocker-uppers. I found that very amusing. But social jet lag and the busyness as a status symbol, all those kind of things jumped out. So I've thrown too many questions at you, but can you just take it from there?
Yeah, so chapter 2, time warps, is a sort of half introduction about how time has warped our sense of well-being, really, and a sense of what is important. And so that some of them are giving introductory ideas, like, so that's the social jet lag, for example, is an interesting idea. It's one of these that I think going back to what I was saying about I just wanted a book that I wanted to write. I think it's interesting about this idea of social jet lag, and if you're not getting natural light, and if you live in certain geographical areas and things like that, and if society meddles with changing time, time used to be essentially based on the sun. Okay, but humans have started, shifting it in March, shifting it back in October, or vice versa, and whatever. And I started to read about, what are the effects of that? And so social jet lag is about not getting enough natural sunlight, essentially, and the effects of it. And we've all got these natural rhythms within us, and if you're just fighting against nature, as a general rule, nature will win. And so if you're constantly having to use an alarm clock, and I ham up, I think I present it as the alarm clock as this tool of death, this tool of torture, where, every now and again we use alarm clocks. But if you're wedded to it, if you can't get up without an alarm clock and you're having to fight up, that's going to have negative consequences for your health. And then underpinning that, all the research is really interesting about, Russia spent quite a few years meddling with time and putting it forward and then stopping it and then putting it forward backwards and then keeping it like that. And so researchers were able to examine the effects of giving people more or less natural sunlight. And there were very big consequences for that. So yeah, so that's social jet lag. And so that first one is an introductory topic, just to set the scene, to say, look, Mr. or Mrs. Reader, time is really important for your psychological and physical health.
There's a couple of things there with the evidence you spoke about, I think, and again, I'm kind of trying to recap on my day on Monday reading the whole book, is that some of those problems with not having enough natural sunlight came down to potentially obesity and mental health and problems like that.
Yeah. Uh, Basically, so I talk about, like, say, social jet lag in this instance, but if you're not getting you're essentially not getting enough sleep, okay, because you're not getting enough natural sunlight. And so that it starts cascading. So if you get not enough sleep, and I can certainly vouch for that right now, because I've got two very young children who are ill at the minute. So if you get not enough sleep, you don't function as well, and you don't make as effective decisions. So I get, a good example of that. So I'm not talking about social jet lag, but I'm talking a little bit about lack of sleep here. But lack of sleep. So this morning I was tired. I didn't get a lot of sleep because of my children. So when I went to make my packed lunch, I was like, you know what? I can't be bothered today. I'll just go to the whatever, the store on campus. And so, that's an example of you're not getting enough sleep, so you make bad decisions. And if you live in certain areas in the world, or you suffer from social jet lag continuously, then that my sort of specific example happens every day. And so you make poorer decisions, and that impacts your health. And so, in the food, in the food example, for example, you make more poorer decisions about food, you eat less healthily, and that has all sorts of negative consequences for your health. So that's a good example of how time, and again, in the introduction, it was about society meddling with time, and how when we meddle with time, we have individual consequences.
I really enjoyed that you kind of try to define time, and we won't go into it now. Let people go and read that, because I really enjoyed it, and I think it framed it really nicely. But I love the phrase of we do not have time has us.
Yeah,
can you speak to that?
That was just a comment or a phrase about. And I'm not one of these that will, hark back to the good old days. But, if I look at, and I mentioned this in the book, if I look around, I can see the time on my laptop. I can see the time on my phone. I can see the time on my watch. I can see the time on the office phone. There's probably a clock somewhere around in the office. And that's an analogy for how time is everywhere now. And so I mentioned apps that can tell us when we should be hungry, or when we should to drink. They buzz if it's time to have a drink, and it's like, well, let us decide when we're thirsty. Things do not have to be so prescribed that we have to do this at this time, this at this time. And I'm not saying we not have routines, but we're just over reliant on this idea of time now, and this ultra optimization of time. I read this a few years ago. I'm going off tangent, but when people going on first dates and stuff, and they're so optimized with time that if you don't impress that person within 5 minutes, they're just going to up and leave. And it's like, give the person a bit of time to impress you, and because we're so restricted, and it's also, people don't have. What I found most interesting when researching the early chapters was this idea that boredom was on the rise at national levels, but so was not having enough time and feeling overly busy. And I was like, well, how can that be? And obviously that's statistical because it's national level. So, but it's an interesting concept that people are getting more bored, and yet they have less time. And it was like, well, how does that work out? And so that's that. All those things can be summed up with the idea. When people say I don't have time, well, yeah, I've got time. It's like, actually, no. As a society, it's not about whether we have time. I think time has us a little bit.
Yeah, I was literally going to ask you about the boredom and the not having enough time piece that you spoke about, but you touched upon it there, because I see it, in a number of places where people are talking about both, or they might say not got enough time, and then they, in another breath, they're telling me about the latest series they've been watching on Netflix, and they've just watched it for 5 hours. I'm like, well, you're just choosing to do things differently.
There's a slightly sort of pedantic bit from me in the early chapters about when people don't have time, and they do. You have time. Everyone has time to exercise. Okay, but what they're essentially saying, well, if they say they don't have time, what they're essentially saying is it's not a big priority. It's not a big enough priority for me to spend time. For example, somebody might have, they might need to be doing 3 jobs to support their 3 children. Okay, now that's a sort of, when they say don't have time, technically, and I'm being pedantic, they do, but they've got so many other priorities that they don't see exercise as a big, quite rightly in that example, as a priority enough. But being specific about the answer helps you then sort of say, well, it's not about carving out more time. It's about, okay, can we fix the higher priorities so they're not as high a priority? And can we increase the priority of exercise, for example, or anything else? And that helps us then sort of solve the issue of people not having time. It's like, well, we do have time. How can we shift priorities accordingly?
And I think just probably a good place to touch on it now, as you do in the book, you kind of put some practical solutions out there. So what practical solutions have you got to take control of time?
Yeah, that's a good question. That was a tricky one because, as I was sort of saying, it's society that sort of like given us this. We're wedded now to time, especially in Western cultures, where if a meeting is longer than 15 minutes, it's a waste of time and things like that. And we're wedded to time. So to some degree, the practical strategy is just be aware of how wedded to time and how much it's impacting upon your well-being. So that's the sort of main take-home point. I won't go through the specific 117 strategies, or not all of them, because you have to read the book for that. But just opening your eyes a little bit to how time is shaping your well-being. Because I give the example of the Spanish women's study, where there was a range of people. Some people thought they were really busy and some people thought they weren't busy. And that had no relation to whatsoever to how they felt. So it didn't matter. There's no correlation between how busy you are and how busy you feel. So generally speaking, it's the first phase, or the first practical strategy, is just an awareness of your feeling out of control and your feeling of busyness might not actually be because of your calendar being full. It might actually be because of your well-being and your state of mind. I think that's probably the key message in the early chapters about, okay, this is what we can do. So it's more, let's fix sort of, or try and sort of improve the well-being a little bit, to then give that person some space to then implement the more practical strategies later on.
That's really nice, because again, in those early chapters, that trying to understand what time is and that concept of time, and then you put in there about different cultures and their perceptions of time. I think it really helps people, or will really help people, to kind of reflect on time and be like, okay, what is time to me, and how does that work for me, and have a bit more self-awareness around time before they can put any of these things into practice. So that totally makes sense what you're saying there. I'm just going to try and move on to just some highlights of some other chapters. I think one of the chapters is called Why Do Mousetraps Work? Can you speak to that and speak to willpower?
Yeah, I'm going to answer the question, why do mousetraps work, but I'll give the clue, because the chapter is about, well, a lot of the chapter is about willpower. And there's a general perception that willpower is necessary to achieve things. Diets, exercise regimes, writing a book, or whatever goal you have. There's a common perception that willpower is necessary, whereas hopefully the chapter gets across, if you're relying on willpower, you're very unlikely to succeed in whatever goal, whether it be health, exercise, whatever. If you're relying on willpower, and willpower is easy to know, how do I know if I'm relying on willpower? If you're having an internal fight with yourself to get off the sofa, because you intended to go to the gym after work. So you've got home, you've had 10 minutes on the sofa, and you're having an internal fight, and it's really difficult, then that's willpower. So if you're having to do that consistently, to do your exercise, for example, then you're not going to succeed. You're going to give up on exercise. And the broad reason is that willpower is not designed for modern environments. Willpower, I say I'm being sort of slightly overly simplistic here, but willpower was designed thousands of generations ago, hundreds of thousands of years ago. And it was designed to sort of provide a balance between immediate needs, and the immediate needs that we had then was food, shelter, etc., and sacrificing those immediate needs for the social group or long-term goals. So that's what willpower was designed to sort of provide a balance with. In other words, when you're over prioritizing long-term goals, it was designed to break. Every now and again, you needed to eat, and you needed to eat now. Okay, so willpower was never designed to be completely robust. Whereas if you transport that system, and our brain, our cortex, etc., is evolving very slowly, so it's getting better at willpower, but that pace of development is very slow compared to the pace of development in our environment the last 200 years, where our environment requires us to have this really, really resilient, robust willpower, and we don't have it. And we walk down the streets and we've got temptation after temptation. I'm thinking food here, so burger joint, kebab, pizza, coffee shop, and so our willpower is just not designed to stay robust, to stay resilient. So if you're relying on willpower, then it's not going to work. Okay, and I give the example in the book about it's willpower should be the tin of spaghetti hoops in the back of the cupboard, where it's an emergency. Okay, you've got nothing in the house, all the shops are shut. Okay, but you need some food. You dip into your spaghetti hoops. Okay, as an emergency. But if you're opening the tin of spaghetti hoops every night and you're just eating spaghetti hoops, then that's going to be bad for your health. Okay, and you're going to be deficient. Okay, and so in the same way, willpower, it's if you're having to engage in willpower regularly to exercise, let's say, then that should be a warning signal that you need to get better quality motivation. Okay, and then how you do that is discussed, especially in the latter chapters.
You're perfectly moving on, without specifically talking about chapters, because it's good examples that you talked about there, and then some of the other chapters being, mind the gap. So where you're talking a little bit about immediate outcomes rather than delayed outcomes, which I think you're kind of speaking to in what we're talking to with willpower, but you can progress onto that. But then the S is for effort is the other one that kind of then links in and takes us through that. So could you speak to, bring those chapters a little bit together and just talk to us about that? So we've talked willpower. Can we talk about immediate outcomes and delayed outcomes? Maybe I think you spoke about the Gestalt principles and then the S curve of effort.
Yeah, the mind the gap is one of my favorites, actually, because I hope it's a relatively simple idea in that, and this is one of the most robust in motivational psychology. This is probably one of the most robust ideas I think there is. In that, I'll take a step back first. And so, so you've got your behavior and you've got your outcome of that behavior. Okay, so again, I'm going to talk about exercise, but it applies to everything. Okay, so let's say you're exercising to lose weight. Okay, now the motivational power is in the outcome, not in the behavior. Okay, so the bigger the gap between the behavior and the outcome, the less likely that the motivational power of the outcome transfers to the behavior. Okay, so I'll explain that a bit more in that. Well, okay, so we exercise to lose weight, which is a common reason to exercise. Okay, people are motivated to lose weight, but losing weight doesn't really happen very quickly. Okay, if you exercise, then it's going to be, you'll probably know more than this. When there's meaningful changes in weight loss, is probably going to take a few weeks.
Or months or years.
Or months or years, exactly. Okay, so there's a huge gap between that. And so people are motivated to lose weight. They're not necessarily motivated to exercise. There's a huge gap there. So the motivational power of losing weight doesn't transfer to the exercise, so you give up. Okay. Whereas if you can shrink that gap between behavior and outcome, in other words, you're exercising for an immediate outcome. Okay, then the motivational power of the outcome does transfer to the exercise and the behavior. And the most obvious example of that is mental health benefits. Most mental health benefits are pretty immediate when you exercise. You will not always, and there's but if you're exercising at the right intensity with the right people, you will feel good afterwards. Okay. Or let's say social benefits are usually pretty immediate. If you go to the spinning class to have a little chat with friends before and after, or maybe even during, then those social benefits are immediate. And so the power of those benefits transfer to the exercise behavior. And when I say transfer, I mean in the brain. The brain doesn't differentiate as much between the behavior and the outcome. It sees it as the same thing. It sees it fused. Okay, so that's a really well grounded example where you should the general principle is focus on immediate benefits. I think regarding exercise, I think most of those immediate benefits are mental health benefits. So if you focus on mental health benefits, enjoyment and mood boosting and social benefits, then I think you will maintain that exercise regime quicker. Now, I'm not saying that weight loss is not important. What I'm saying is don't do that don't you have weight loss as your primary motivator. What I'm saying is if you exercise for enjoyment or social benefits, you will keep doing exercise and the weight loss will follow. So, weight loss may well be a valid goal, but don't use that as your primary motivator. So that's the idea behind Mind the Gap. And the S is for effort is really interesting because anything, and I'll stick to exercise, but again, it's relevant to all different types of examples. Exercise is quite hard, it's quite difficult. It can be, particularly for new exercisers. And so we've got a problem there because the brain, again, is evolved pretty slowly compared to our environments. So our environments now, because we're so comfortable, we're all sitting on our nice comfy office chairs here. Our environment is now that we need to exert effort. We need to use effort for health benefits to be healthy. Okay. So in other words, we need to be active to be healthy because our environment is so sedentary, or a lot of people's environment is so sedentary. So we need to use effort to be healthy. Whereas our brain is still in the primitive ages where it's to be healthy, you need to save effort. Because the primary dangers were infection, predators, etc., etc. So our brain thinks that we should save effort, whereas we shouldn't. Most of us are in an environment where we should use effort, and there's that conflict again, where how can we overcome that? And so that chapter is about, how can we redefine effort? How can we, why can some people override this idea that effort is aversive and climb mountains and sail oceans, just for the sake of it, whereas others can see exercise as a waste of effort. So that chapter is all about how we can overcome, and the S is for effort is related to, if we think about effort over the course of an activity, effort is pretty high compared to other periods at the very beginning. So what we need to do is overcome the effort at the beginning, and then we get the metaphorical ball rolling, and exercise sort of carries on. So I think I give the example where if we're going for a jog if we think about a jog, especially if we're new people to exercise, if we think about going for a jog, it's like, that's even a couple of kilometers. That's a big old task for the brain to think, oh yeah, I'll do a couple of kilometers. Okay. The effort is too high for our primitive brain. Okay. So how do we override that? Okay. Well, we forget the run and we think, okay, what's the first mini goal within that larger goal? Okay. And it's probably something like get off the sofa. Okay. And actually, so then your brain thinks, well, actually, that's not as much effort. I'll just get off the sofa. And then it's, okay, well, what's the next task? I just need to get changed into my running gear. Okay. And then, so you're setting these micro goals that really reduce the amount of effort the brain thinks it is. Okay. And so you're almost forgetting the jog. And if you do that and you find yourself that you manage to open the door, once you've opened the door, you're probably going to go for a jog. You know, there might be the occasional time when you open the door and there's a big black cloud and a light of thunder and you think, no, thanks, and go back in. But for most people, most of the time, once you've opened the door, you're going to go for the jog. Okay. But if you were thinking about going for that whole 2K, 3K, whatever, jog in the first place, that's a whole bunch of effort that the brain thinks, no, thanks, I'm going to save my effort. Whereas if you break it down to just putting your clothes on, getting your footself out the door, once you make that first step, then the effort is much less. There's less inertia, there's less motivational inertia, and you carry on. So that's in essence what S is for effort is about.
There's lots of both of them that come back to, so I own the fitness collective and we're a gym that motivates a lot of people to kind of try and exercise, and we try and do loads of those things to remove those barriers. So anybody joining a gym, they've got this, I'm not signing up for 12 months and all that kind of thing. Well, we don't do that. We've removed that. We do the goal setting and we look at diets and we look at exercise and all that kind of stuff. But the first thing for us is get people through the door.
Exactly. And
it's a nice environment. You get a nice cup of coffee. It's a nice environment. The kind of that gym intimidation that people talk about hopefully isn't there once they get in that door. And then to make things continuously easy, we have an app and a booking system, and people turn up to appointments. So they book there and then, first time there. When you come in next, what time? The exact time. What day can you do? Removing all those barriers, and it's about turning up. And then when you turn up, there's no decisions to make because we've got a template of the exercises that you're going to do. We'll adapt it for you individually. And then, as you said before, the kind of mental health side, the goal of our coaches is to make sure that those members, it's the best thing they do that day. So they leave thinking, this was great, I'm going to come again. Right, book now. When you come in next time, see you then. And the kind of process of continuing to hit those things ends up where they end up getting quite good results. But I like the way you framed it, because loads of those things that we do are for those reasons. So hopefully we're doing things well.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, when you talk about going to the gym, it's the same principle as a jog. When you might get the odd person who does this, but once you've got to the gym, you're probably going to do exercise. So when you're back at home, if you think about the whole workout that you're going to do, that's quite intimidating for the brain. But if you just think, just get to the gym, and at the worst, I'm going to have a nice chat with Martin and go home. But once you get to the gym, you're probably going to exercise. So it's those sort of breaking those goals down. And you speak about your trainers and your coaches saying about enjoyment. People carry on doing what they enjoy. Okay, it's probably the most fundamental principle of motivation, in that if you enjoy something, you do it again. And so I see people all the time. It's because I live on a sort of like quite a popular jogging route, because I live near a river. And you see it especially in sort of January, but not but other times as well. And people, their faces are contorted in pain because how fast they're going on their jog, because they see people who are sort of who have ran for 20 years, and they see the pace that they're going, and they think that that's the pace that they've got to go, and they're just and their fists are pumping, their faces are contorted in anguish. And I just look at them and think, your brain's going to say, no, thanks, I'll not do that again. And so enjoyment is just, and that's why there's so many different types of exercise and physical activity, which is even broader, that you need to find something that you enjoy. Otherwise, your brain is going to tell you not to do it. And you can override that, but you know, these are principles, but for most people, if you're not enjoying it, then you're going to give up. You know,
Yeah.
and so, you know, and motivation is complex, but if you pick that simple one out, you'll do very well as a good start. Yeah, and that's why I don't consult with people who are new to exercise or anything like that. But if I did, I'd say go for a walk. If they've never exercised before, or if they hate the term exercise, just go for a walk because for most people, walking would be reasonably pleasant.
Well, there's research in the school of walking does wonders, or walking works wonders, I think we have.
That's right.
So yeah, walking's great. Couch to 5K, very popular. Links to loads of the ideas that you've spoken about there. So yeah, I mean, all very relevant around exercise. Just bringing it back really to the book, because there's probably a couple of elements that I'd like to touch upon. One of them was around the benefits of solitude, but then I also want to lean towards the B goals side of things. So if you want to just touch upon the benefits of solitude just before we get to B goals.
Yeah, solitude isn't it? So the book, the chapter is about spending time in solitude, basically, and I'll bring it to sort of exercise and health at the end if I remember. Solitude can be very, very good, but unfortunately, we've got to a state where one of the studies that I cite, and I can't remember the specific percentages, but this is really one of the reasons I like psychology is there's quite a lot of like funny or funky experiments done. But essentially, people gave researchers gave their participants a choice between an electric shock and spending 15 minutes of time on their own. And like I say, I can't remember the specific percentages, but there's a crazy amount of people that thought, no, I'll take the electric shock, thank you very much. And it just was like, what's going on with the world if people can't spend 15 minutes in their own head, which they pretty much have complete control over? They'd rather take an electric shock, which I thought was fascinating. And then I sort of got into the sort of real sort of philosophy and old school psychology about solitude and stuff, and that's where you create new identities. Okay, so once you've got over, and solitude, like I say, for a lot of people can be, you know, if you've got a lot of anxiety and stuff like that, solitude will be full of anxiety and worry and stuff like that. But if you can break that through that and just sort of stick with it and get through that, solitude becomes the sort of essentially the fitting room for new identities. You know, you know what, and you start to look to the future when you're in solitude, and that's when really good things start to happen. You know, you're no longer regretting things that you did and you wish you do that, and you're no longer worried about the present and anxious about the present. You start thinking, well, what if I did that? What if I did that? You know, what if I signed up for that exercise class in the future, and so forth. So that's the idea of just spending a little bit of time in solitude for your well-being, and not avoiding anxiety too much. And I hopefully say it several times. I'm not talking about clinical levels of anxiety. For that, you need professional help. But just normal, I'm going to call it normal levels of anxiety. When you're in solitude, you can work through that, you know, as like if you don't avoid it. And so that idea of just sitting there and thinking it through, and the anxiety dissipates. And then you start thinking about the future, and you can try different identities on and things like that. And but I do have a little bit about solitude and exercise solitude and running specifically. I talk about is that running can be quite good for solitude, but only if the brain can think. So in other words, it's got to be at relatively low intensities. So if you're running at a relatively high intensity, then your brain will be taken up with managing the discomfort and the physiological responses. But if you then run at a low intensity and you can start to think, then running or cycling or whatever, but if it's low intensity, then you allow the brain to start to think. And the last thing about solitude really is about quite a significant part of people's identity and who they are is because of who they think they should be. And it's all these social obligations and social pressures, and that creates a large part of your identity. But if you unplug from that in solitude, then you can then decide who you really want to be, and you can think about who you really want to be. And then that links into chapter 10, I think it is, about B goals. And B goals are one of the most robust goals that you can have. So in simple terms, or relatively simple terms, I think to be an exerciser is a lot easier than to do exercise. So in other words, if you've got this B goal to be an exerciser, if your character is an exerciser, you find it really easy to exercise. You don't need willpower. You don't need huge lots of mental effort to get off the sofa and go to the gym, okay? Because it's part of your character. And we're generally inclined to sort of try and demonstrate our character, our true character. So if you can, whereas people who just want to do exercise or have a better body by exercising, those types of goals are not as motivationally powerful. So you will quite often need huge amounts of effort, huge amounts of willpower to be able to carry on with your exercise. So the chapter is basically encouraging you to think about who you want to be, and then, okay, well, what does that person do? So I give loads of examples outside. I think, I want to be a good dad. I want to be an exerciser. I want to be a business person, and think about then what are those behaviors that I'd like to exhibit. And, it's not going to be automatically, just because I want to be an astronaut doesn't make me an astronaut. Do you know what I mean? So it takes time, and it's hard, and it's not simple. But if you start to think about who you want to be and set a goal where, okay, I want to be an exerciser, then over time, every time you do exercise, then that does become a little bit of your character. And every time, you won't notice it on a daily basis, but if you focus on motivation that way, every time it will become a little bit easier. Okay. And then one day, and I'm being a little bit, a lot overly simple. One day, you'll be an exerciser, and it's all of a sudden, once you're an exerciser, it's really easy to exercise. So it's a bit unfair, I always think, where you see these people with bodies of Adonis, and they live in lycra and stuff like that. Exercising is part of their character. It's a bit unfair because it's really easy for them to exercise, whereas people who don't have that character, it's really difficult. And the problem is, these people who are exercisers just tell the other people, "Go on, it's just easy, just do it, just get out the door and do it." And it's like, well, no, my motivational systems are working very differently. Thank you very much. It's difficult for me to exercise. So I always think it's quite unfair. And that's why it's, you need to be very empathetic to be a fitness trainer or whatever, because you're probably an exerciser and it's very easy for you to exercise. Whereas your clients are probably not exercisers, and it's very difficult for them to exercise.
Interesting, because in our recruitment process, when we're recruiting coaches, we know about that. We think about that, and we don't want the person who is, I'm a personal trainer because I just love being fit myself. Mm-hmm. That's always going to be an element of it, but we really do dig into why are you a trainer? Mm-hmm. And if they're not, and I mean, there's lots of people doing this nowadays, but if their first thought isn't because I like helping people, then they're not for us. If their first thought is, well, I like being fit, therefore, no, that's not for us, because you're just going to say, do what I do and be like me. I'm the hero, and that isn't where we sit. But I love how you've developed kind of that what you've just spoken about there, the solitude piece, and in previous things you talked about environment and people in environments and around social circles and things like that, heavily influenced by other people, and might not be able to develop who they want to be without going into solitude, and then might not be able to then develop those B goals that you talk about that can be so successful in becoming who they want to be. Years ago, when I worked in Australia, my mentor at the time talked about be before you are and you will become.
Yeah.
And that sat really nicely with me, because it's like, well, if you want to be a business owner, you've got to be around business owners, understand what
Yeah.
they do. Then you've got to start kind of mimicking those behaviors and making those small developments to develop yourself to become. And then at some point you do become, like you just talked about exercise, and somebody on that journey you spoke about, in my head I was just thinking, well, yeah, at some point somebody goes, well, you're really fit, aren't you? And again, we have people in the gym and new people will come in and go, yeah, but everyone's really fit. Like, you didn't see these lot 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
you know, they have become that, and without entering this door, you won't be able to. So all of it spoke to me really well. It would be, I really want to mention one bit that's in your book, and I can't help myself, because you mentioned bounce back ability, which was one of my favorite phrases from back in the day in Soccer AM and those days. I was just throwing that in there because I had to, because I loved bounce back ability.
Yeah.
Where did you come to with bounce back ability? Was it Soccer AM? Is that where?
Absolutely. It might not have been Soccer AM, but it was, it was the Premier League in the 90s, and Ian Dowie, I think it was. Yeah. So Ian Dowie gets a mention in the book about bounce back ability. And that's another positive about B goals, is that if you're driven by B goals, you essentially have good bounce back ability, where, I'll stick to the exercise example, where if you're driven by being an exerciser, and one day you don't exercise when you should have, or not when you should have, but when you intended to, then you wake up next morning, but you'll still be an exerciser. You think, do you know what? I'm still an exerciser, so today I'll do it. Whereas if you're driven to exercise by weaker sort of should have, do goals, then the wheels typically fall off a lot quicker. You're driven by exercise for having a better body, and you don't exercise when you intend to, you're more likely to think, oh, well, there's no point anymore. I'm not, because those goals are not as motivationally powerful and not as motivationally resilient. So B goals have bounce back ability, basically.
I'm going to have to bring that bounce back ability into the Fitness Collective, because we talk about it a lot. We talk about self-sabotage or self-destruction. And, if you decide you're going to have a drink on a Thursday night and it actually turns Thursday, well, screw it, it's Friday, Saturday, Sunday. You've done 4 days, 4 bad days and only 3 good days. Like, you need to bounce back ability, show more bounce back ability. I'm definitely stealing that back, because I lived the phrase back in the day. Yeah. I'm just conscious of time. I really enjoyed speaking to you. And one thing I wanted to end on was your top 5 hacks. Now, I tried to do this and came up with 21, but it'd be good to see if you have like top 5 hacks that people can take away from your book. What would they be?
Yeah. This is testing me now, because I can't. The last chapter, I'm thinking, what actually did I say? I like the idea of doing things as soon as possible. And when I say doing things personally important first, which is the opposite of clearing the decks. Quite often people are like, I'll get the rubbish away that I don't want to do, but I'll just do it, and then do the personally important stuff later, and then because of a host of reasons I discuss in the book, you end up not doing it. So doing personally important things. So if you're not an exerciser, but you really want to begin exercise, get it done in the morning, or get it done as soon as possible, however your schedule and routine does. So I like that one. And the book is testament to that, actually. The book would never have happened if I did not get up and do the book first. And sometimes, some days before brushing teeth type first, so that I really subscribe to that. And again, I say to the book, I'm not talking about the super optimization morning routines where at 5 a.m. I'm da 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 da. I'm just like, get up, I mentioned brushing teeth, but you don't have to be that serious. Just get up, do your breakfast, and then do the important stuff first. Do the personally important stuff first. So that one, the immediate goals, like I say, that's one of the most robust finding, I think, in motivational science, in that if you're using long-term goals as your motivator, you can have long-term goals, but don't use them as a daily motivator. You've got to enjoy it or get some value out of it immediately. Is number 2. Number 3 would be, and this is, and I appreciate that some people can't do this, but I like turning my emails off. So if your work allows it, it's work in some sectors is the lowest form of work. You know, you do it to waste time essentially. So turn your email, or we can broaden it out. Turn off distractions. I'm a big subscriber to the solitude one. Is good. I think everyone needs time to think, and specifically think about the future. I think people are excited by hope and plans and things like that. So solitude helps with that. I can't remember how many I've done there. I suppose the one not to do is this reliance on willpower that we've spoke about. There are some ones that are a bit tongue in cheek, when it's like, you know, if you live in China, live near Beijing, otherwise your health is going to deteriorate. So that's a good one if you want.
All good bits of advice.
All good bits of advice. The one that the micro goals about effort is a good one. Break the goal down. And again, the book is a good testament there. Sometimes I just didn't want to I thought about writing a chapter, especially when the deadlines came, actually. When the deadlines come, it makes it less fun. But it's like, right, I've got to write some book here. And it was too daunting for my head. But I was like, okay, right, no, focus on getting the laptop open. And once you open the laptop, then the writing starts. And so the micro goals is a good one. And then one we haven't spoken about is don't panic too much at the end, because effort naturally rises at the end of the task for a host of reasons. So even though you've got a lot left of a task, don't worry, because your effort will sort you out. Your effort will increase, and you'll start prioritizing. And so I don't know how many I've done there, but there's a few.
You almost fell into my trap. Like I said, when I highlighted in the book, I got to 21 that I highlighted. I'm cheating, because I'm going to read 5. So I'm just going to read the top 5 that come through from me that I've highlighted in the book. So the first one I highlighted was be more Violet Crawley. Busyness should not be a status symbol. Then I went for replace dead time with activities that are good for your mojo. We didn't talk about that much either. So loads of little tasters here that people need to dig into. Drastically reduce the length of your work meetings and other commitments. I think we could implement that one at Loughborough. Yeah. Routinize as many things as possible so you don't have to make any scheduling decisions. That was another one for me. Yeah. And then I really like this one. So final one for me, adopt the motivational perspective of children by doing things for the sake of doing them. Children know best.
Yeah, that's a good one. That speaks to the immediate, young kids just run across the room for the sake of running across the room. They don't run across the room to lose some weight. And so that's I
often say to people when kids are, I don't know, rolling down a hill or just spinning around, I often say to you, when did we decide we weren't going to do that anymore? And that was no longer fun. And I don't know. But that some of those little bits there, I think, speak to the fun and humor that's in the book as well as hopefully giving people a little taster there of some of those bits of advice that we've not even talked about that are in the book. So conscious of time, we've spent 45 minutes here really talking about the book, and I've enjoyed every second of it. I've enjoyed reading it. I would say to people, if you've got a flavour of what we're talking about here with this book, go out and get hold of it. Go out and buy it, because it really is an interesting read. And if you can implement any of the strategies, it's going to make a difference to you and your time and motivation. So just to finish on, where can people get hold of the book?
They can get it in all good bookshops, as they say,
and even better
online, conventional bookstores, and you can get Audible or for your Kindle or whatever. So it's in all different formats as well. So yeah.
Excellent. So just go on Amazon or wherever you buy your books, and look for Time Hacks: The Psychology of Time and How to Spend It by Dr. Ian Taylor, and go and have a read. Go and get involved. when the podcast's out, comment, let us know what you think. You know, even challenge Ian's thinking. That's what we like to do in research if you want to. Not mine, only Ian's here. But yeah, Ian, I've loved having you on. Thank you very much. And hopefully our listeners will appreciate the podcast and they'll just go out and have a go at the book.
Thanks for your time, Martin. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks for listening to the Experts in Sport podcast. If you'd like to get in touch, then please contact me, Martin Foster, at m.foster@loughborough.ac.uk. Thanks for listening. See you next time.